And so let's welcome Frank Powell.
Thank you. That's very good. Thank you very much. I think we've been doing Stephen D. Lee for almost 20 years now, and I think I've been to all of them except for 2 or 3. So when Chuck asked me to speak, I knew either they're running out of speakers or getting very desperate. I wasn't sure which, maybe some of both. But I'm no expert on Southern literature by any means, but the old saying of it's not what you know, but who you know came true this time. I contacted my friend Boyd Cathy, and he helped a great deal on this, and he contacted Clyde Wilson, who helped us put it together. So you're actually getting 3 for the price of 1 with these comments here today. So we are going to talk about Southern literature, but this subject, as you may imagine, is very broad. So we need to narrow it down, but you can only narrow it down so much, but we do need to give it some precision and some parameters. So first, we need to examine some fundamentals. For there to be a Southern literature, there has to be a real historical living South, with a population and a people who self-identify historically and culturally as part of the region we call the South. That population must feel and be intuitively a part of a community of largely shaped beliefs and actions. And that community must stretch from the old Atlantic states of Virginia, North, South Carolina, and Georgia, all the way across Florida to Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. That is, the South is a real community, not just a symbol or a myth. So first, I propose to give some background, to offer some substance and definition to what we call the South, and Southern tradition and heritage. And then to show that that region, our region, was a unique living country with its own traditions and its own heritage and its own literature. I realize for you, I don't need to justify the South as a unique region, a region which would have taken its place as a separate and respected nation if not Lincoln and his armed forces had not invaded and brought havoc to our land. But in today's world, a whole lot of folks are attempting to do just that, to deny the South's existence as a separate and unique region, a real country who fought for its existence during 4 cruel years of war against a vicious authoritarian central government, and which was molded by the shadow horrors of the war. Some historians and authors like to say the Southern traditions and heritage we defend today were shaped uniquely by slavery and the slave experience, and therefore our literature is only a derivative or a lesser branch of American literature. They are wrong. They are dead wrong. The South was already a developing and vibrant entity long before the war, long before the creation and founding of the United States. In this point, I must acknowledge my debt to several historians who have researched this and written about this. First and fundamentally is the noted historian Richard Beall Davis. Davis has demonstrated conclusively in his 3-volume exhaustive history titled Intellectual Life in the Colonial South, 1585 to 1763. This was published by the University of Tennessee in 1970. It was in the South where distinctive communitarian individualism developed, which distinguished it almost from the beginning from other regions of America. From the earliest landing at Jamestown and the settlements in South Carolina and Georgia, the Southern colonies developed differently from those of New England. Although by no means in conflict with its inherited British heritage, as were the Puritan settlements and the traditions to the north, the South did over the years very gradually modify its rich Anglo-Celtic patrimony, adjusting to distance, circumstance, climate, the presence of Indians, and the mixture of additional folk from other European countries, with all of their customs and traditions. The result was quantifiably conservative and localist. Professor Davis equally lays to rest the interpretation of Southern history and character, which attributes everything to the presence of slavery. This is not to deny that slavery as an issue exercised an influence on Southern thinking, certainly on the lead up to Fort Sumter. But slavery in the 19th century was not seen as the critical make or break question that it is seen today. Many countries, including Russia and much of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, had a form of slavery. And England had only ended it a generation or two before the war between the states. And most American states had had the institution only gradually freeing the slaves. As we know, in 1861, several slave states remained in the Federal Union. And in the 1860 election, Lincoln had promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed. He did not consider it a reason for his invasion of the southern states, at least not until 1863, when his Emancipation Proclamation was used as a political war measure to attempt to rally Northern radicals behind his attack on the South. Indeed, one critic of the proclamation declares rightly that it attempted to free slaves where it had no authority to do so, the unconquered regions of the South, but left it completely intact in those areas of the Union where it could have freed them, such as Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky. And also, if you're discussing or arguing the presence of slavery with people, just mention the fact that West Virginia in the middle of the war was admitted as a slave state into the United States. How does that work to fight to free the slaves? Let them explain that to you. In 1985, the late Mel Bradford, perhaps the most significant writer on Southern culture during the last half of the 20th century, gave a fascinating lecture at the National Humanities Center in the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. His commentary on Richard Beale Davis's pioneering work and understanding in the South of it and its history is titled, "Where We Were Born and Raised, the Southern Conservative Tradition." In it, there is a section which deserved to be quoted in full, and I quote, "The South thought and acted in its own way before the peculiar institution was much developed within its boundaries. Colonial Southerners did not agonize in a fever of conscience over the injustice of the condition of those Negroes who were in bondage among them. Contrary to popular misconception, intense moral outrage on slavery was almost unheard of anywhere in the European colonies in the New World into the late 18th century, and was decidedly uncommon then. The South embraced slavery in its colonial period because Negro slavery seemed to fit the region's needs, and because the region, through the combination of its intellectual inheritance brought over from the England of the Renaissance with the special conditions of this hemisphere, had reached certain practical conclusions," end quote. Even back in 1970, Professor Davis was able to apprehend the attempt of neo-abolitionist historians to attach an overriding importance to slavery in the early development of Southern culture and character. Davis writes, and I quote again, "It is difficult to see that in the slave colonies any consistent rationale, if indeed any at all, developed in defense of the peculiar institution, simply because there was not a sufficiently powerful attack upon it to warrant or require a defense. The development of natural and blood and soil conservative of the South predates the furor over slavery," unquote. And one last quote or comment on the South of the distinctive culture, and this is from perhaps the most preeminent historian of the South in the late 20th century, Dr. Eugene Genovese. In 1985, he sat down with Dr. Boyd Cathey, who interviewed him extensively for Southern Partisan magazine. Based on his more than 3 decades of scholarly research, here's the conclusion Genovese reached, and it's found in far more detail in his volume titled The Mind of the Masterclass. I quote, "I think that those Southerners who perceived themselves by the 1850s as being in the process of forging a separate nationality and as being a people apart were right. I think this was one of the great difficulties in the way of any type of compromise. Northerners, from their perspective, had to see the country as one. Southerners had to see themselves increasingly as a separate people who were trying to negotiate a coexistence. This is reflected, it seems to me, in the difference in constitutional perception. For Southerners, the Union was a compact, They put it in states' rights terms, and that meant something very real to them. I don't underestimate it. But at the bottom of that, and I think this can be demonstrated in their own testimony, was the notion that the Constitution made possible the political coexistence of two radically different social systems. And therefore, from their point of view, the Constitution was a way to live and let live. From the Northern point of view, it's much closer to being a national document. They never accepted the notion that this was a solemn compact between two equal social systems, end quote. So I think it is clear from these and other resource sources that the South, from its earliest history, developed not only as a generally distinct region, but because of this, its culture, its heritage, and its literature would necessarily reflect this foundation. Dr. David Hackett Fisher, in his revolutionary volume, Avalon Seed, which was published in 1989, traces the transatlantic migration of colonists from the British Isles to our shores. He argues conclusively that the core aspects of American culture stem from four British regional cultures, and their interaction and conflict have been decisive factors in the United States political and historical development. Those settlers in the South mostly came from traditional conservative, largely royalist areas of southern England, or from deeply familiar areas of Scotland and Ulster. These settlers from Britain, with their customs and community-based society, would coexist and meld with others, such as the Catholics of Maryland and Louisiana and the Germans of the Piedmont, which formed a distinguishable region with a rich and distinctive heritage. Now, with this foundation, let us turn to Southern literature, or more specifically, to the Southern literary tradition. And let us understand why it is by far not only the most conservative and religiously grounded portion of what we erroneously call American Lit, but is also the most connected to and the continuation of the great Western Christian and classical heritage, which actually began in classical Greek and Rome. Then it was taken over by the great saints and scholars of the church, and then passed down to the colonists who came to southern shores. These colonists brought with them their culture, their history, their religious faith, and their literature. And unlike the Puritans of New England and others who settled in northern colonies, they did not come over here to set up some fanatical shining city on the hill or utopia of the elect. But they came to find new land to raise their families and establish their communities, much like the communities they'd left in England or Scotland or Germany. Let me offer now a list and description of some volumes which I think are essential in any overview of Southern literature and the Southern literary heritage. I would single out 4 works anybody interested in our literature should consult and use as essential references. First, there's J.B. Hubbell's classic survey, The South in American Literature, which, although published 70 years ago in 1954, is still perhaps the best overview of our literary tradition and survey of major works produced by Southern writers. But let's plow a little deeper. We need to examine the origins of our Southern literature and just how our culture and successive history shaped it. Here I would mention a very important study by Dr. James Everett Keebler. It's titled The Classic Origins of Southern Literature. Dr. Keebler is a South Carolinian, and his book was published by the Abbeville Institute back in 2017. He illustrates, I think, conclusively that our literary and cultural heritage owes very much to what is sometimes called the Great Tradition. By that I mean the great classical heritage of ancient Rome and Greece as taken over and Christianized by the church and then passed on to us intact by our ancestors. Keebler discusses in detail various Southern writers, many of whom are unknown to our generation, but who exercise an outside influence in what has become the Southern literary tradition. One of the finest guides to real Southern culture, which produced our literature, is by the late North Carolinian and University of Chicago professor Richard Weaver. His very important book, The Southern Tradition at Bay. If you don't know it or haven't read it, you should. because it's one of the cornerstones in familiarizing yourselves with Southern history and literature. Weaver is particularly perceptive on the Southern literary reaction to the defeat of the Southern armies in 1865, and how Southern authors use that tragic defeat as a springboard for a deeper understanding of the nature of our culture and what some writers have called the tragic sense of life. The fact is, the South and Southerners are the only portion of the American Federation to have experienced the horrors and ravages of defeat. And that defeat has affected not just our history, but also the very powerful literature which appeared after 1865. A fourth volume I would recommend highly is Mel Bradford's book titled Generations of the Faithful Heart on the Literature of the South. Bradford's study is essentially a detailed examination of our literature and literary heritage as it developed and flowered after Appomattox. He discusses several important and very significant writers. Defeat on the battlefield and its consequences had a profound effect on the South and the moral imagination of a newer generation of authors. Let's look at a few of the Southern writers who wrote in the colonial period. Dr. Keebler identifies several who need to be better known. First, he discusses Ebenezer Cook, who was born in 1665 and lived in Maryland. As Keebler points out, most notable scholars of the colonial period now acknowledge that Cook was the greatest American humorist of the 18th century. His most famous book is titled The Sotweed Factor. That's SOT-weed. It was published in 1708, and it pokes good-natured fun at those who don't understand or appreciate the rural culture of his native land. Also in the early colonial period lived the great poet John Markland from Virginia. His praise and poetry of the Southern land and community contrasts sharply with the zealous Puritan desire to force its radical beliefs on everyone it came in contact with. And have we not seen how disastrous that policy of zealous globalism has been in recent years? Then we come to William Byrd II, perhaps the greatest and finest literary figure in the South before the American Revolution, and one of the most brilliant authors of the colonial period. He lived from 1674 until 1744. Keebler describes him as erudite, witty, cultured, passionate, earthy, and sometimes risque. To read Byrd is to have a perpetual smile on your face, maybe occasionally to be a bit scandalized by his bawdy humor. His writings are very descriptive, and sometimes he seems to be taking friendly pot shots at his fellow Southerners. But underneath it all is his real love for and devotion to Virginia and the Southland. Of all the works he wrote, perhaps the most famous is titled History of the Dividing Line, run in the year 1728. It's a marvelous work. It used to be read in literature classes years ago, but now it's been subject to council culture. Byrd was charged by the royal governor of Virginia to survey the boundary line between the Old Dominion state and North Carolina, and he left us a delightful account of his travels. To give you an idea of Byrd's style and humor, let me quote from History of the Dividing Line. This is his description of the North Carolina men he encountered, and I can stand up here and say this since I'm from North Carolina, but if a Virginian was up here saying this, I'd be highly insulted. And I quote, "Surely there's no place in the world where the inhabitants live with less labor than in North Carolina. It approaches nearer to the description of lubberland than any other, by the great felicity of the climate, the easiness of raising provision, and the slothfulness of the people. The men, for their parts, just like the Indians, impose all the work upon the poor women. They make their wives rise out of their beds early in the morning at the same time that they lie and snore, till the sun has risen 1/3 of its course and dispersed all the unwholesome damps. Then after stretching and yawning for half an hour, they light their pipes, and under the protection of a cloud of smoke, they venture out into the open air. though if it happens to be ever so little cold, they quickly return shivering to the chimney corner. When the weather's mild, they stand leaning with both their arms upon a cornfield fence and gravely consider whether they had best go and take a small heat at the hoe, but generally find reasons to put it off till another time. Thus they loiter away their lives with their arms crossed, and at the winding up of the year scarcely have bread to eat. To speak the truth, it is a thorough aversion to labor that makes the people file off to North Carolina, where plenty and a warm sun confirm them in their disposition to laziness for their whole lives. End quote. So, you can see Byrd was a colorful wordsmith, and his descriptions not only humorous, but they tell us why he was America's first great storyteller. Now, moving on into the 19th century, I would mention that President Thomas Jefferson was also an excellent essayist, and some of his works qualify as great literature as well. Then there's John Taylor of Caroline, another great Virginian, who not only excelled at writing, but he authored several treatises on political issues, including the traditional states' rights interpretation of the United States Constitution. But perhaps his most famous work is Orator, published in 1813. It is both a great literary work, but is also a profound defense of agrarian society and what we would call strict constructionism. Jefferson considered Taylor the most outstanding defender, and I quote, "the original and true principles of the Constitution creating them, which has appeared since the adoption of the instrument," end quote. Later Southern thinkers, notably John C. Calhoun, were clearly indebted to Taylor. Many literature surveys tell us James Fenimore Cooper was the first great American novelist, but Cooper must share that distinction with writers such as Johnson Jones Hooper, who was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, and then moved to Alabama in 1835, where he began publishing short stories about his rascal character, Simon Suggs. He collected those stories in the volume Adventures of Captain Simon Suggs, late of the Tallahassee Volunteers. The main character, Simon Suggs, has this motto, and I quote, "It is good to be shifty in a new country," end quote. This fully incarcerates a backwoods version of the archetypes we now know as a confidence man, a grifter, and a professional flim-flam artist. Hooper's sketches and parodies were so influential that they inspired Mark Twain. Other pre-war between the states writers demand attention. First, there's John Pendleton Kennedy from Maryland. In addition to serving as Secretary of the Navy under President Millard Fillmore, Kennedy wrote several significant historical plantation novels, including Swallow Barn in 1832 and Horseshoe Robertson, a tale of the Tory ascendancy in South Carolina in 1780. This was published in 1835. Washington Irving was so delighted with Horseshoe Robertson that he read it out loud to his friends. Kennedy was a friend and an associate of the great Edgar Allan Poe and assisted him with his career. Of course, Edgar Allan Poe is probably the most famous Southern writer prior to the war, even though he was born in Boston, Massachusetts. We won't spend much time on Poe, as he is widely known as his poetry and short stories, and his work with the Southern Literary Messenger magazine. Poe died in 1848 of tuberculosis, but the Messenger continued publication right up into the War Between the States period, including publishing a strong defense of secession in February of 1861. Of course, we're all familiar with some of Poe's works, his poetry, his Gothic horror stories, his satire. Thousands of books and articles have been written about them and about him. He certainly was one of the greatest writers produced by America in the 19th century. I'm certain some of you had to memorize some of his poetry while in school, maybe The Raven or Annabel Lee, or you read some of his short stories like The Black Cat or The Fall of the House of Usher. Now we advance to the mid-century, and the South is already a distinct region, vividly aware of the differences between its largely agricultural-based life and the fanatical descendants of the Puritans, the abolitionists, and the financial and industrial oligarchy of the North. It's the poet and novelist William Gilmore Simms who towers above many others. Like Edgar Allan Poe praised his novels, and in particular his historical work, The Yemassee, published in 1835 about the Yemassee Indian War in South Carolina in the early 1700s. And he also wrote The Partisan on the Revolutionary War. The Partisan was one of the most popular novels ever published in the South. Simms was also a great poet, and like his younger associate Henry Timrod and several others, he understood fully the mounting hostility and hatred of the North against the South. In 1850, Simms published his satirical work, The Father Abolitionist. And I really love this because it begins by having Satan flee out of hell because it's so overrun by bossy Puritans that they've taken over hell and made it unbearable. He had to leave. And in his volume of collected poems, Simms takes sharp aim at Yankees and their desires to totally control and dominate the South Country. In his poem, My Man Tom, he declares, and I quote, "Tom, none of your Yankee pomps for me. Weave me no wreaths from the maple tree, nor trouble yourself to please my mood, to seek where the Quaker roses brood. The myrtle alone, good Tom, be mine, with a cheering bowl neath the southern vine." End quote. For Simms and his associates, the war for Southern independence and the defeat and Reconstruction helped men meld the South through fire and sword, emphasizing for every thinking Southerner the importance of memory and the heritage received from our ancestors. It is the war which acts as a crucible for Southern literature and crystallizes the consciousness of Southerners that we are indeed a separate people from our neighbors north of the Mason-Dixon line. Great Southern writers like Timrod and Simms understood this, and their writings illustrate the real emergence of a new Southern nation which was created in 1861. Foreseeing the breakup of the American Confederation as early as 1842, Simms wrote the essay Agricultural Labor, which defended the rural South and heralded future Southern independence. Let me give you another quote. This is a stirring passage from that. "If you love your country, if you look upon her maternal plains as the patriot should look, with the yearning love of a son for the mother who has borne him, then you will not desert her in her age and feebleness. You will cling to her to the last. You will repair her broken fortunes. You will enrich her decaying fields. You will give her the whole strength of your manhood, and you will make your grave in her bosom." End quote. This total devotion to and love for the Southland is perhaps even more manifested in the work of the man who's called the poet of the Confederacy, Henry Timrod. Young Timrod attended the meeting of the first Congress of the new Confederate States of America in Montgomery of February 1861. While there, he composed and read aloud his stirring epic poem, Ethnogenesis, which is literally translated as the birth of a new people, the birth of a new nation. Here are the first few lines of that inspiring work pronounced at the beginning of the new Confederacy. I quote once again. "Hath not the morning dawned with added light, and shall not evening call another star out of the infinite regions of the night to mark this day in heaven? At last we are a nation among nations, and the world soon shall behold in many a distant port another flag unfurled. Now come what may, whose favor need we court? And under God, whose thunder need we fear? Thank him who placed us here." End quote. But Timrod is most well known by his grand lament for the Confederacy, his ode to the Confederate dead, sung on the occasion of decorating the graves of the Confederate dead at Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston in 1867. It's not very long, many of you know it, but I think it'd be good to quote it once again. "Sleep sweetly in your humble graves, sleep martyrs of a fallen cause, though yet no marble column craves the pilgrim here to pause. In the seeds of laurel in the earth, the blossom of your flame is blown, and somewhere waiting for its birth, the shaft is in the stone. Meanwhile, behalf the tardy years, which kept in trust your storied tombs. Behold, your sisters bring their tears, and these memorial blooms. Small tributes, but your shades will smile more proudly on these reefs today than when some cannon-molded Powell shall overlook this bay. Stoop, angels, hither from the skies. There is no holier spot of ground than where the defeated valor lies, by morning beauty crowned. Timrod evoked the deepest feelings of Southerners after the heartbreaking defeat in 1865, and I think his ode still does that for us today. As you can well imagine, both Sims and Timrod have been canceled by the dominant woke academia in the present day. They've been condemned as defenders of slavery. Nevertheless, the classical elegance and beauty and deeply felt emotion of their works remain to give us pleasure and continue to inspire us. During Reconstruction and the last portion of the 19th century, much of Southern literature was kind of a panegyric, a memorialization of Southern heroism during the war, and a lament for the honored dead. But even more, Southern writers, in particular Southern novelists in their works of fiction, defended their homeland and its righteous cause. 5 authors stand out in this period and continue their careers well into the 20th century. They are John Easton Cook, Thomas Nelson Page, Joel Chandler Harris, and Thomas Dixon. And the female author is Augusta Jane Evans. Each of these writers, in his or her own particular manner, romanticize and idealize the Old South. Each of them, through their writings, sought to remind their fellow Southerners of the valor of the soldiers and in many ways the righteousness of their cause. Perhaps the most successful was Thomas Nelson Page, whose series of short stories, collected in the volume titled In Old Virginia, published in 1887, featured the tales of Morris Chand. Later, Page published the story Burial of the Guns. In it, he describes the refusal of a Confederate artillery regiment to surrender their guns. Rather, they rolled them over a cliff into a river. Here he informs us what has happened, and I quote, "We're all volunteers, every man. We joined the Army at the beginning of the war, and we struck through to the end. Sometimes we ain't had much to eat, and sometimes we ain't had nothing. But we fought the best we could. 119 battles and skirmishes as near as we can make out in 4 years, and we never lost a gun. Now we are going home. We ain't surrendered, just disbanded. And we pledge ourselves to teach our children to love the South and General Lee, and to come when we are called, anywhere and anytime, so help us God." These sentiments find an echo in Thomas Dixon, the author of several historical novels about Reconstruction, including the very popular The Leopard Spots, A Romance of the White Man's Burden, and his historical novel, The Klansman, which provided the basis for the first great American film, The Birth of a Nation, which President Woodrow Wilson had privately screened in the White House in 1915. The Birth of the Nation, as you can imagine, remains highly controversial. But it cannot be denied that this epic, directed by a pioneer of American cinema, D.W. Griffin, is a watershed event in American and world filmmaking. Griffin, by the way, was the son of a Confederate veteran, as was Will Rogers, the most famous humorist of this day. Georgia writer Augusta Jane Evans, although not well known today, was a widely read and lauded novelist whose post-war work, St. Elmo, published in 1866, sold more than 1 million copies within 4 months of its publication, easily topping the potboiler Uncle Tom's Cabin. But in today's politically correct environment, one hears almost nothing about Evans while we drown in praise of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Screed. We all know of Joel Chandler Harris, whose Uncle Remus stories delighted many of us as children, and which formed the basis of one of the greatest films of all time, certainly Disney's greatest, The Song of the South, which was released in 1946. Sadly, due to the evil spirit of our present society, Song of the South has never had a commercial release on DVD. Disney, after Walt Disney's death, went totally and insanely woke. Yet there are copies of this which can be had if you search hard enough. Now, the period of American history from World War I until the late 1960s was a time of a reunion between North and South. Hollywood filmmakers produced a great number of fair, if not frankly, pro-Southern movies, many based on Southern literature. Not just Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, the film version, which remains the most viewed film of all time, but once popular films such as the 1935 movie So Red the Rose, based on a war novel by Stark Young. Young was part of perhaps the greatest American literary movement of the 20th century, the Southern Agrarians. Centered at Vanderbilt University, these 12 literary giants included poets, novelists, playwrights, and historians, and essayists from several Southern states. Even today, poets Allen Tate and John Crow Ransom continue to stand as two of the finest poets, not just of the South, but of the American nation. Robert Penn Warren authored All the King's Men, a novel which served as the basis for one of the country's finest films. The historian Frank Onsley produced in 1949 a path-breaking study, Plain Folk of the Old South, which examined the role of yeoman farmers in Southern history. But of all the Southern agrarians, the one who may speak to us most meaningfully in our decaying culture where our heritage is threatened is Donald Davison. It was Davison who essentially gathered the group of 12 together to produce and publish in 1930 the Southern Manifesto, I'll Take My Stand. In it, these 12 literary masters elaborated an eloquent restatement of the South's cultural heritage, its greatness, and detailed significant differences between the vision of the South and that of our northern cousins. Forthrightly anti-business and anti-corporalist, the authors of I'll Take My Stand celebrate and defend not only the conservative agrarian inheritance of the South, but also fully understand the importance of being rooted in a place, in a family, and in a community of like-minded folks, and above all, obedient to and worshiping a merciful God. Davison himself is one of the South's great poets. In addition to a number of nonfiction works, he authored one of the finest poems ever written by a Southerner, a poem which expresses the faith of Southerners even after the defeat of 1865 and the torturous history since then. The epic poem is titled Lee in the Mountains, and the last portion, which is a clarion call to Southern folk of every age, needs to be read out loud. The narrator calls upon all generations of Southerners to be faithful to their God-given traditions and heritage and never to abandon them, because God will not forsake them. Here is that last reminder and call to renew faith. I quote once again. Young men, the God of your fathers is a just and merciful God who, in this blood once shed on your green altars, measures out all days, and measures out the grace whereby alone we live. And in his might he waits, brooding within the servitude of time, to bring this lost, forsaken valor and the fierce faith undying and the love quenchless, to flower among the hills to which we cleave, to fruit upon the mountains whither we flee, never forsaken, never denying his children and his children's children forever, until all generations of the faithful heart. End quote. Our great Southern writers, novelists, poets, and essays of the past 50 or 75 years are far too numerous to discuss in detail. I would like to mention in passing the fine novelist Caroline Gordon, whose novel of the war, None Shall Look Back, merits reading. Then there's the great Georgian Flannery O'Connor, whose novel Wise Blood made it into a successful film. But it's her 2 volumes of short stories, A Good Man is Hard to Find, and Everything That Rises Must Converge, remain her enduring legacy. Deeply religious and from a staunchly Southern Catholic family, O'Connor examines original sin and evil in the world, sometimes with a profound sense of satire and wire humor. Often O'Connor writes ironic, subtle, allegorical fiction about deceptively backward Southern characters who undergo transformations of character which frankly are accomplished through pain, violence, and ludicrous behavior in the pursuit of holiness. However grotesque the setting, she tries to portray her tractors as open to the touch of divine grace. It was O'Connor who once wrote that the South was Christ haunted and wondered if it would even exist without God's grace. Like O'Connor, novelist and nonfiction writer Walter Percy, Alabama-born but a longtime resident of Covington, Louisiana, grappled with the inescapable human need for religion, the element of faith in the lives of his characters. His protagonists faced the isolation and loneliness of modern life and always the search for something that would satisfy them beyond the material world. Of his novels, The Moviegoer, Love in the Ruins, and The Second Coming stand out as expressing the challenges of modern life, which seem to only end in despair. Now, his cousin, whose memoir, Lanterns on the Levee, is one of the finest memoirs of plantation life in Mississippi, Walter Percy was trained in the sciences and medicine at several prestigious universities. Soon he became aware that it must be more to life than the answers that science offered. In 1947, he converted from agnosticism to the Catholic Church. Now, perhaps the greatest American novelist of the 20th century was the Mississippian William Faulkner. Faulkner spent his boyhood listening to stories told by him by his elders about the war, about slavery, about Reconstruction, and his family. Young William was greatly influenced by the history of his family and the region in which he lived. Mississippi marked his sense of humor, his portrayal of Southern characters, and his timeless themes, including fiercely intelligent people who are dwelling behind the facades of good old boys and country bumpkins. Faulkner's great output includes celebrated novels such as The Sound and the Fury in 1929, Light in August in 1932, and Absalom in 1936. He also wrote numerous short stories. Many of his novels were turned into films. A first-time reader should possibly start with his works Unvanished and Intruder in the Dust, which would be much more accessible to a beginner. Faulkner's work is deeply influenced and immersed as his life as a Southerner. His works have been examined by many critics from a wide variety of critical perspectives, including his position on slavery in his South and his view that desegregation was not an idea to be forced on people, arguing that desegregation should go slow so as not to upend the Southern way of life. Although not considered a hardcore conservative during his lifetime, in our current society, his views and writings put him at odds with the dominant progressive insanity which runs rampant through our so-called intellectual class. There are numerous passages and portions from Faulkner's which could be quoted, but one in particular from his novel Intruder in the Dust, published in 1948, stands out for its profound understanding of the moral imagination as a real part of Southern character. Through our imagination, our vision of the past, we discover the importance of remembering who we are and remembering our history. And I'll have to say, even before I ever read this, as a 9 and 10-year-old boy, I thought this, and now as a 70-year-old boy, occasionally I still feel it today. So let me quote. I'm sure you've heard it, but it's worth saying again. For every Southern boy 14 years old, not once, but whenever he wants to, there's this instant when it's not yet 2 o'clock on that July afternoon in 1863. The brigades are in position behind the rail fence. The guns are laid and ready in the woods, and the furled flags are already loosened to break out. Pickett himself, with his long oil ringlets and his hat in one hand and probably his sword in the other, is looking up the hill, waiting for Longstreet to give the word. And it's all in the balance. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't even begun yet. Not only has it not begun, but it's still time for it not to begin. Against that position and those circumstances which made more men than Garnett and Kemper, Armstead and Wilcox look grave. Yet it's going to begin. We all know that. We've come too far with too much at stake. And that moment doesn't even need a 14-year-old boy to think, this time. Maybe this time, with all this much to lose and all this much to gain, Pennsylvania, Maryland, the world, the golden dome of Washington itself to crown with desperate and unbelievable victory to desperate gamble, end quote. This moving passage illustrates the vital significance and hope and resilience for Southerners. Our vision, our imagination must recall our history. We must remember our heritage and our past. For people who have discarded their past have no future. Our great poets, novelists, and writers speak to us. Southern literature not only reminds us of the exploits of our ancestors, their victories and their hardships, but their hopes and dreams, which were never did. Faulkner also wrote this, which I really like, and I'll quote once again. Never be afraid to raise your voice for honesty and truth and compassion against injustice and lying and greed. If people all over the world would do this, it would change the earth, end quote. Robert Lee Frost was not a Southerner. He was from Vermont, yet he was raised in a strongly pro-Confederate, pro-Southern family. In one of his poems, titled The Black Cottage, he wrote these words, which could be our watchwords. For, dear me, why abandon a belief merely because it ceases to be true? Cling to it long enough, and not a doubt it will turn true again. For so it goes. Most of the change we think we see in life is due to truths being in and out of favor. As I sit here, and oftentimes I wish I could be a monarch of a desert land, I would devote and dedicate forever to the truths we keep coming back to. Through hardship and persecution, we Southerners have a magnificent inheritance which can give us strength and inspire us in hope, if we embrace it, and like Mosby and Forrest, use it with God's help to defeat the forces of evil arrayed against us. Our great Southern writers did, and now so must we. Recall the words of President Jefferson Davis said after the war in 1873, quote, "Truth crushed to earth is truth still, and like a seed will rise again," end quote. Thank you, and long live the South.